He was only 2 years old, left alone in the freezing forest by someone who was supposed to love him.
Nos chus.
No food, just a stuffed rabbit in his tiny hands, and tears frozen to his cheeks. But when all hope seemed lost, an old German shepherd appeared, limping, tired, and listening for a cry. What happened next changed two broken lives forever. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below, we'd love to hear your city. The wind rolled cold off the ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, slipping like silent fingers through the bare trees and across the frozen surface of a narrow river that ran deep through the forest. Snow had not yet fallen heavy this season, but the ground was frosted with the hush of early winter, white dusting bark and boulder alike, softening the world into silence. In this silence, a car's tires crackled down an old gravel road, slow and deliberate. It was a blue SUV, rust around the wheel wells, the back window cracked and sealed with duct tape, the kind of vehicle that carried more stories than it did passengers. The car stopped abruptly near the riverbank, far off from where any hikers would wander. The engine idled for a moment, then died. The woman behind the wheel, Melissa, pushed her sunglasses to the top of her head and glanced in the rearview mirror. Her face was pretty in a distant, polished way, framed by caramel blonde waves that fell too perfectly over a black faux fur collar. But the tightness around her mouth, the short, sharp movements of her hands, spoke of someone wound too tight, too long. She got out and walked around to the back seat, where a small child sat in an oversized car seat, bundled in a yellow fleece snowsuit with bare ears on the hood. The boy, barely 2, clutched a floppy stuffed rabbit against his chest. His eyes were light brown, rimmed red from the cold, or crying, or both. He looked up when Melissa opened the door, his lips parting. "Ma!" "No," she said quickly. Not harsh, not cruel, just final. She unbuckled him with stiff hands, her breath fogging the cold air. Then she lifted him, he was so light it startled her, and set him on the ground. He wobbled a little on his soft boots, confused. The stuffed rabbit dangled from one mittened hand. She placed a faded tote bag next to him. Inside, a bottle of apple juice, half full, a Ziploc with crackers, a thin wool blanket, nothing else. Melissa crouched, brushed his curls once, but didn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I can't do this. I'm not who you need." Then she stood and walked back to the SUV. She didn't look back. The engine groaned, then caught. The wheels spun once in the frost before catching the road. The boy watched silent. The red taillights slipped between trees and vanished into the stillness. He didn't cry at first. He just stood there, like he wasn't sure what this game was. After a few minutes, he took 2 small steps toward where the car had disappeared, then stopped. The cold stung his cheeks. He looked around at the unfamiliar woods, then down at his rabbit. He sat, and only then did he start to cry, softly at first, then louder, a wail broken by shivers, high-pitched and hollow, the kind of sound that cut through trees and distance like a signal flare from the heart. Miles away, an old German shepherd stirred under a collapsed woodshed near an abandoned ranger station. Bruno had once known warmth and a purpose. He had worn a badge on his collar, slept beside firemen, run towards smoke and screams. But years and injuries had put him out of service. They'd tried to rehome him, but no one wanted the limping dog with the cloudy eye and the torn ear. So he had wandered, and ended up here, where nothing asked anything of him but to survive. Until he heard the cry. It wasn't a sound the forest made. It wasn't fox or fawn or even bird. It was a human sound, small and sharp and wrong. Bruno lifted his head. The fur along his spine prickled. His ears twitched toward the sound, and then, without knowing why, without needing to, he rose and began to move. Back near the river, the boy had stopped crying only because he was too tired. His cheeks were blotched pink with cold. His nose ran freely. He had crawled onto the blanket, wrapping it around himself, sitting beside the tote bag now open and dusted with frost. He held the rabbit under his chin. His breaths came fast and shallow. The wind picked up. He flinched, and then a rustle. Snow crunched. A shape moved between trees, big and dark. At first he whimpered, but the shape slowed. A low chuff, almost like a sigh, reached him. Bruno stepped into the clearing, his gait slow but deliberate. The boy blinked up at him, sniffling, afraid, but not screaming. Not anymore. He seemed to understand something, a truth beneath words. Bruno walked a slow circle around the boy, sniffed the bag, the blanket, the child's face. Then he lay down beside him, pressing his thick fur against the boy's tiny frame. The boy leaned against him almost instantly, his fingers digging into the coarse coat. He made a sound like a sigh, and his eyes drifted shut. And so the sun slipped lower, and in the hush of the forest, there was no more crying. Only the heartbeat of a boy pressed to the warmth of an old dog. Two forgotten lives, curled together against the snow, while somewhere, far beyond, the world went on without them. But not forever. Snow fell more heavily now, soft flakes catching on bare branches and the soft fur along Bruno's shoulders. The old German shepherd had curled around the boy for hours, letting his body heat seep into the fragile child, listening to every flutter of breath. But Bruno was trained for more than comfort. Somewhere deep in his mind, past the years of wandering, of aching joints and half-remembered commands, was a pulse, an instinct. Find help. The child needed more than warmth. He needed people, shelter, fire. Bruno could give protection but not rescue. The boy stirred, a faint whimper escaping his lips as he blinked into the snowy dusk. His small hands gripped Bruno's neck, half asleep. His nose was red, his lips dry and cracked. The stuffed rabbit had fallen somewhere beside them, half buried in frost. Bruno stood carefully, letting the boy's weight roll off his side. The child made a small protesting sound, but Bruno nudged him gently with his nose. The boy looked up at the dog's face, close and warm with deep amber eyes, and somehow, without words, he understood enough to reach for the thick fur at Bruno's neck. He held on as Bruno stepped forward slowly, checking every patch of snow, every scent in the air. The trail Bruno chose was not one of ease, but of memory. He remembered a place, faintly, the scent of wood smoke, old iron tools, salt from soup. It was a long walk for old legs, longer still for a toddler stumbling barefoot inside soft-soled boots. But Bruno moved at the boy's pace, pausing often, letting him rest, nudging him upright when he fell. Above them, the sky turned from dusk to deeper gray. The snow thickened. Once, the boy sat down and refused to move, his little face pinched with fatigue. Bruno circled back, nudged the rabbit into the boy's arms, then lay beside him for a few minutes. The boy curled against the warm fur, rested, then rose again. They walked like that, half step by half step, until the forest began to open. Just beyond a cluster of snow-covered pine trees, a narrow chimney exhaled a ribbon of smoke into the evening sky. The cabin sat low to the ground, dark logs stacked tight, with faded green shutters hanging crookedly on either side of the window. Firelight flickered faintly behind frosted glass. Inside, Frank Dillard stirred stew in a dented iron pot hung above the hearth. The man moved slowly, as though his limbs were unfamiliar to him. He was 67 years old, broad-shouldered and slightly stooped. His hair, once coal-black, had thinned to gray wisps at his temples. He had a beard, not neat but not wild either, and eyes that had learned to stop expecting visitors. Years ago, this cabin had echoed with the laughter of his wife and son. Then a collision on I-81 had taken both, leaving only silence behind. Frank had come here to finish his grief alone. The cabin was quiet, the woods constant. Nothing asked for words, until a sound reached him, something sharp, like a cry cut short, then a scratch at the door. Frank frowned. He put down the ladle, crossed the cabin in 3 heavy steps, and opened the door. There, in a swirl of snow and pine scent, stood a German shepherd. Muzzle frosted, eyes steady, and leaning against its side, barely upright, was a child. Tiny, unmistakably human, clutching a ragged toy rabbit and trembling. Frank stared. For one moment he could not move. His mouth opened, then closed again. It was the dog who stepped forward first, pushing the boy gently toward the door. The child swayed, barely able to stand. Frank dropped to one knee. "Hey!" he said, his voice cracking from disuse. "Whoa now! Who the hell?" The boy looked up at him. Big eyes. Tired eyes. Too tired for fear. Frank reached forward, scooping the boy into his arms. The weight hit him like memory. It had been too long since he'd held something so light, so breakable. He backed into the cabin, dog and all, and kicked the door shut. "Jesus!" he muttered. "What in the—" He laid the boy on the old couch, grabbed the wool blanket from the rocker and wrapped him tight. Then he reached for the kettle, poured warm water into a mug, added honey and a splash of salt. With shaking hands, he dipped a rag and gently wiped the child's face. The dog sat silently near the fireplace, steam rising from his fur. Watching, Frank finally looked over. "Where did you come from, huh? You two alone out there? No collar, just gray around the muzzle, a scar across the ear." "Damn," Frank whispered. He turned back to the boy. The child's head rested on the couch arm. His tiny fingers still clutched the rabbit. He was already asleep. Frank sat back on his heels, staring. He should call someone. Authorities. Sheriff Grant, maybe. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed on the floor until the boy's breathing deepened. Then he leaned back against the rocker, lit his pipe, and for the first time in 10 years, felt something shift in his chest. Quiet click, like a locked door being tried. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But in the cabin, the fire crackled steady. And 3 beings, 1 old man, 1 older dog, and 1 boy barely big enough to walk, slept beneath the same roof, gathered not by blood or plan, but by need. Morning came not with sunlight, but with a dull gray spread across the sky, like someone had laid a wet sheet over the world. Snow still fell, slow and lazy, blanketing the Blue Ridge cabin in hush. Inside, the hearth glowed low and steady. The boy was still asleep on the couch, curled like a comma beneath the wool blanket, 1 arm draped over his stuffed rabbit. His tiny chest rose and fell in a soft rhythm, as if the very air of the cabin had taken on the responsibility of breathing for him. Frank Dillard sat in the rocking chair a few feet away, unmoving, a cold cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. He hadn't slept. Instead, he had watched the boy's fragile sleep, watched the old dog, curled near the door like a living rug, ears twitching every so often, watched the fire, watched the wind shift snowflakes against the window pane, watched the ghosts in the corners of the cabin that had learned to go quiet over the years. Now there was breath here, small and living and unfamiliar. Frank exhaled through his nose, set the cup down, and stood with a quiet creak of knees. The dog raised his head slightly but didn't move. Frank stepped into the small kitchen and opened a can of condensed milk. He poured some into a pan, added water and set it over the wood stove. Then he peeled a banana, mashed it into a bowl, and stared at it like it had offended him. "Hell do I know about feeding a baby?" he muttered. The boy stirred then as if summoned. A soft sound, part yawn, part whimper. He blinked, slow and confused, and sat up halfway. The blanket fell to his lap. His curls were matted on one side, and his lips parted as he looked around the room with wide, unsure eyes. Frank approached, bowl in hand. "Mornin', kiddo." The boy said nothing. His eyes settled on Frank's weathered face, on the lines that cut deep around his mouth, the heavy brow. Then they flicked to the bowl. I got some food. Not much, but better than ice." Still no reply. Frank crouched down, holding the bowl. "Here, buddy. Let's try this, huh?" He reached for a spoon, then paused. "You got a name, kid?" The boy blinked. One hand clutched the rabbit tighter. The other rubbed his eye. Bruno, rising stiffly from his corner, trotted over and sat beside the boy, like punctuation. The boy leaned slightly into the fur, then reached for the spoon with unsteady fingers. Frank handed it over gently. "All right then," he said quietly. "No words. That's fine." He sat back on his haunches and watched as the boy brought the banana mush to his mouth, smeared more on his cheek than he ate. Frank sighed. This is gonna be interesting. Later that morning, Frank retrieved an old box from the attic, full of blankets, stuffed animals, and a few dusty board books. It had belonged to his son once, before the accident that hollowed the house. He dusted them off and brought them down. The boy watched silently, wide-eyed, as Frank laid the items out on the floor. A faded fire truck, a cloth picture book, a teddy bear missing one eye. The boy didn't reach for any of them, but he didn't shrink away either. Frank scratched his chin. You're a quiet one. That's all right. I used to know a dog like that. Wouldn't bark for nothing. Just listened better than most people. Bruno let out a soft chuff as if agreeing. Frank looked at him. What's your story, huh, old boy? The dog gazed back, head slightly tilted. Well, Frank said, standing up and wincing at his knees, I guess we all got our reasons. Outside, the snow eased to a drizzle of flurries. Frank put on his thick coat, opened the door and stepped out. Be back, he called into the cabin. Gonna get some wood. He didn't expect the boy to follow him, but after only a few steps he heard the soft padding of boots behind him. He turned. The boy was bundled again in the oversized snowsuit, mittens dragging, rabbit stuffed under one arm. Bruno walked beside him, ever vigilant. Frank frowned. You can't stay out here long, not dressed like that. The boy looked up at him, not defiantly, not stubbornly, just quietly. Frank sighed and lifted him up. All right then, you win. He carried the boy out to the woodshed, where he chopped a few logs under the boy's watchful gaze. Eli, as Frank began to think of him, though he didn't yet know that name, seemed fascinated by the rhythmic swing of the axe, the crack of wood, the way Bruno paced in slow circles near the trees. When they returned to the cabin, cheeks red and hands cold, Frank brought out an old box of alphabet blocks and scattered them on the rug. The boy sat down and began arranging them, not spelling anything, just placing them in straight lines, one after the other. Hours passed. No words were spoken, but something was forming in the space between them. Late that afternoon, Frank stood by the window, looking out toward the woods, arms crossed. He hadn't thought about calling anyone yet. The sheriff might take the boy to a home some cold foster setup. And the dog? Probably put in a kennel. No, not yet. Not until he knew more. Behind him, a sound. A small, hoarse voice. Frank turned. The boy was holding one of the blocks. He pointed to it, then to himself. "Eh?" he whispered. Frank blinked. "Eh?" Another point. "Aye. Eli." The boy nodded. Slow. Then hugged his rabbit and said nothing more. Frank turned back to the window, heart tight. Outside, the snow was melting from the trees, dripping like a clock ticking down. But inside the cabin, something else had begun. A name given, a life reclaimed, and a man who had long stopped hoping, dared to believe in small miracles again. The first crack of thunder came not with warning but as a low growl across the mountains, deep and distant. Frank looked up from the half-split log in his hand and squinted at the sky beyond the tree line. The clouds were darker than before, roiling low like something heavy was pressing down from above. It wasn't just snow anymore. This was a storm coming in fast. Winter's voice raised in anger. "Better get inside," Frank muttered. He glanced toward the cabin, where Eli sat on the front step bundled in a patched-up wool coat, the sleeves too long for his small arms. Bruno lay beside him, tail sweeping the porch slowly. The boy was humming, a soft, tuneless sound, as he tapped two wooden blocks together. He hadn't spoken again since saying his name, but the humming had started that morning. It wasn't music, not really, but it was life. Frank had paused when he heard it the first time. For a man who had lived alone for nearly a decade, the sound had startled him more than the silence ever had. He walked over, scooped up the firewood under one arm, and looked down at the pair. "Storms movin' in. Let's go, boys." Eli stood immediately, as if understanding the tone. He reached for Bruno's neck like he always did when unsure of his steps. The dog rose patiently, letting the boy use him as a railing. Together they entered the cabin just as the wind picked up and the trees began to sway. Inside, Frank stirred the fire higher and filled the kettle. The room dimmed early as thick clouds crowded the light. Rain started, then sleet, tapping hard against the windows. Eli sat cross-legged by the fireplace, trying to match puzzle pieces from an old wooden set. Bruno dozed nearby but opened his eyes each time the wind howled. Frank stood at the table, staring down at the old landline phone nailed to the wall beside the pantry. He had touched it twice since Eli arrived, both times only to stare. He still hadn't made the call.
No, Sheriff.
No child services. Not yet. He rubbed his forehead. "What am I doing?" he whispered. But outside, the wind answered, and he turned back to the boy, who had laid the final puzzle piece with great care and now looked up at Frank like he'd done something grand. Frank smiled, slow and honest. "You're a clever one, Eli. Smarter than me, I bet." That night, the power went out. The wind screamed down the valley, rattling the windows and groaning through the chimney like an old ghost. Frank lit the oil lamp and pulled Eli into his lap with the blanket. Bruno lay curled at their feet, ears twitching. Thunder cracked, and the boy startled, pressing into Frank's chest. Frank held him steady, wrapping both arms around the small body. "It's just noise, son," he said softly. "Just the sky getting rid of some anger." For a while they sat in stillness. Then Eli shifted and tucked his head beneath Frank's chin. That simple, wordless trust broke something loose in Frank's chest that had been locked tight for years. He exhaled, eyes stinging. Outside, the storm raged. The next morning, the world was transformed. Ice glazed the ground in hard silver sheen. Branches bent low, some snapped entirely, and a telephone pole down the road had cracked at the base, wires dangling like frayed ropes. Frank walked the perimeter of the cabin with Bruno while Eli napped, assessing the damage. The chimney had held. The roof had held. But the road out was blocked by 2 fallen pines. There would be no driving into town, not for a while. He returned inside, rubbing his hands together. "We'll be here a bit longer," he said aloud, not knowing if he was relieved or terrified. He warmed stew on the stove and sat with Eli at the table. The boy drank milk from a chipped cup, holding it with both hands. Then, without being asked, he offered the last sip to Bruno, who licked it clean. That afternoon, Frank finally asked, "Do you know where your mama is?" Eli looked up, his brow furrowed. He clutched his rabbit tighter and turned his face away. Frank didn't press him, but he knew. That night, while Eli slept curled up with Bruno, Frank opened the trunk at the foot of his bed, the one that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were photographs, letters, a baby blanket. He lifted them gently, like they were made of smoke. At the very bottom, folded neatly, was a child's drawing. Stick figures, a sun, and a dog with an oversized head. The name Daniel written in big, uneven letters. His boy. He set the drawing aside and reached into the back corner of the trunk, where a stack of faded forms sat in a manila folder, emergency contact numbers, fire station rosters. Among them, a photo fell free. It was of Frank in his younger days, kneeling beside Bruno in his service vest. "You saved lives, didn't you?" Frank murmured to the dog. "Guess you're not done yet." He placed the photo on the mantel the next morning, right beside the lantern. And when Eli woke, rubbing his eyes, Bruno sat beside him like he always did. But this time, the boy looked at the dog, then at Frank, and smiled. The first real smile. A beam of light through long-closed shutters. And Frank smiled back. It was the sound of crunching ice that pulled Bruno from his light sleep. The old shepherd raised his head from the braided rug by the door, ears twitching toward the tree line beyond the frosted window. Outside, the ice was melting in jagged rivulets, dripping from every eave and branch. The snow still lay thick in places, but beneath it, the world was stirring again. And now footsteps, not animal, heavy, human.
Bruno stood.
Inside the cabin, Eli played on the floor, lining up puzzle pieces like tracks in the dirt. Frank sat at the table sorting through a pile of old mail, most of it unopened, all of it years old. At the dog's sudden tension, he looked up. His eyes narrowed. Someone out there? Bruno let out a short, low bark, the kind he hadn't made since arriving. Frank stood slowly, his old joints cracking as he moved toward the door. He reached for the rifle mounted above the hearth. Not out of panic, but memory. Mountain living taught you to greet strangers with caution. Outside, the forest held its breath. Then, through the trees, a figure emerged. He was a tall man, wrapped in a brown oilskin coat, snow-caked boots crunching across the crusted ground. He wore a tan beanie pulled low over his ears, and a canvas backpack slung over one shoulder. His beard was thick, but neatly trimmed. He walked with purpose, though not speed, like someone who had covered miles and wasn't surprised by solitude. Frank stepped onto the porch, rifle in one hand, not yet raised. Bruno stood just behind him, a silent shadow. The man stopped several yards away. "Morning," he called, his voice calm, with a hint of breathlessness. Didn't mean to startle anyone, just saw smoke. Frank studied him. "This is private land." "I figured." The man nodded. "Name's Caleb Stokes. I've been searching the valley the last few days." He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a worn photo. "I'm with a volunteer search crew. We're looking for a missing child." Frank didn't move, but something in his chest pinched. Caleb held out the photo, stepping slowly forward. "A boy, about 2 years old. Disappeared during a storm 4 days ago. His name's Eli." Behind Frank, the door creaked open. The boy peeked out, his rabbit in one hand, curls matted from sleep. Caleb froze mid-step. Frank turned, saw Eli standing there barefoot in the doorway, eyes wide and uncertain. Bruno brushed against his side protectively. The boy stepped back, half behind the dog. Caleb lowered the photo. "That's him." Frank's grip tightened on the rifle, not in aggression, but in indecision. He stepped aside, ushering Eli gently back inside, then motioned for Caleb to follow. They sat around the kitchen table. Frank gave Caleb a cup of coffee. Bruno didn't sit. He stayed close to Eli, who sat on the floor near the stove, back pressed to the warm bricks. Caleb explained that the boy's mother had gone missing, stepmother, actually. She'd left a note claiming she'd dropped him off at a park and panicked. The story had unraveled within hours. They tracked tire prints into the lower forest, but the storm buried the rest. Official search crews gave up after 2 days. Only Caleb and a few volunteers kept going. "You found him," Caleb said finally, voice low. "That dog. He led him here?" Frank nodded. "He found me." Caleb watched the boy for a moment. "He doesn't say much? Just his name." They sat in silence a while. Then Caleb spoke again. "I'll need to bring him back. We've got folks, nurses, social workers. He'll be taken care of." Frank's jaw tightened. He looked at the boy, now drawing shapes in the soot with one finger. Bruno curled beside him. "He is taken care of." Caleb met his gaze. "I can tell you've done right by him. But he needs more than a cabin and a good dog. He needs a future." Frank stood and turned to the window. "I buried my son 8 years ago. There ain't a day I don't wonder what kind of man he'd be now." He turned back. "This boy shows up in the middle of a storm, with nothing but a toy rabbit and a dog. And he trusts me. I don't want to let him go to some system that doesn't know how to hold something this breakable." Caleb didn't respond for a long time. Finally, he said, "You don't have to decide now. There's still paperwork. Foster placement, temporary custody hearings. Takes time." Frank's shoulders relaxed the smallest amount. "I'll be back in 2 days," Caleb continued, standing. "With someone official. Someone who knows what questions to ask." Frank walked him to the tree line. Before leaving, Caleb turned. "The dog. He's something else." Frank glanced back at Bruno. "He's the reason the boy's still alive." When the man was gone, Frank returned to the cabin. Eli had fallen asleep on the rug, rabbit tucked under his chin. Bruno lay beside him, one paw over the boy's leg. Frank stood there a long time, then bent and gently picked up the child, placing him on the couch, tucking the blanket around him. "You found me, kid," he whispered. "And I found you." Outside, the ice began to thaw, and spring was no longer a rumor, but a promise. The morning Caleb was meant to return dawned quiet and bright. The ice had mostly melted, leaving behind brittle twigs and puddles that mirrored the shifting clouds. The land, for the first time in weeks, seemed to breathe again. But inside the cabin, a heaviness settled in the walls, like the house itself understood that something precious stood on the edge of change. Frank stood at the kitchen counter, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. He hadn't taken a sip. The boy was still asleep on the couch, his body tangled in the blanket, his stuffed rabbit tucked beneath his chin. Bruno sat in front of the hearth, alert and still, as if he too was waiting for something to arrive and hoping it wouldn't. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, a sound Frank usually didn't notice, now loud in his ears. He walked to the front door and opened it slowly. The wind smelled of thawing bark and old pine. A cardinal chirped somewhere in the trees. If it weren't for the ache in his chest, it could have been a perfect day. He remembered a line his wife once said after the funeral, her voice brittle but clear. "God doesn't take everything, just enough to teach you how to hold what's left tighter." Frank closed the door. An hour passed, then another. Eli woke quietly and padded over to him, rubbing his eyes. Frank knelt down, brushing the boy's hair back from his forehead. "You hungry?" The boy nodded. Frank made oatmeal, stirring slowly the way his wife used to do. He added honey this time, watched the child eat without a word. It wasn't until late morning that the sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. Bruno was the first to stand. Frank stepped outside, shielding his eyes. A forest green SUV pulled into view. Caleb stepped out first, this time in a clean coat, no pack. Behind him emerged a woman, early 40s, neatly dressed in a gray cardigan and pressed jeans, a clipboard clutched in her hands. Her name was Marla. She had the kind of smile that looked practiced, but not dishonest. Frank led them inside. The introductions were brief. Eli sat quietly on the couch, Bruno beside him like a statue. Marla took a few notes, then knelt gently before the boy. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly. "My name is Marla. Do you remember me?" Eli blinked, then slowly shook his head. She smiled again. "That's okay. I brought some toys if you want to see." He didn't respond. Bruno let out a soft breath, his body rigid. Frank stood by the window, arms crossed. Marla glanced at him. "Mr. Dillard, I need to ask. Has the boy said anything about his family? Anything at all?" "Only his name." She nodded, made another note. "He's bonded with the dog?" "You could say that." Caleb cleared his throat. "We're here to assess fit, not just gather. If the boy's been safe, cared for, we consider continuity, especially in trauma." Marla nodded. "Yes, that's true. But we have procedures, evaluations, temporary placement hearings." Frank's jaw flexed. Eli climbed off the couch and walked over to Frank. He took the man's hand, small fingers curling into his calloused palm. He didn't say a word, but he stood there, chest to leg, anchored. Marla saw it. Her expression softened. Caleb stepped forward. "There's precedent, Frank. If you're willing to file as emergency kin-like placement, we can start paperwork now. It'll buy time. Let the boy stay here. For now." Frank didn't speak. Eli looked up at him. Bruno sat quietly, watching. Finally, Frank said, "What do I need to sign?" 3 weeks later, the cabin looked different. Not by much, but enough. The windows were clean. A second pair of boots now sat beside Frank's by the door. The firewood was stacked higher. A new box of crayons lay open on the table. And a photo, of Bruno lying next to Eli asleep on the rug, had been pinned above the mantel. Outside, spring had begun to whisper green into the trees. The world was changing. Frank sat on the porch, a cup of tea in hand, watching as Eli toddled toward the edge of the yard, his rabbit swinging from one hand. Bruno walked slowly beside him, always watching, always near. Frank had filed the paperwork. Home study would come next. Maybe court hearings. Maybe not. Marla had said something about a strong case for permanency. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was now. What mattered was the boy. Alive, smiling, safe. Eli turned back toward the porch, his curls catching the light, and waved. Frank waved back, blinking against the sun. His heart was full. Not fixed, not healed, but full. Inside, the wind chime his wife once loved stirred for the first time in years, and the cabin breathed again. Sometimes, God sends his miracles in the quietest ways. A lost child rescued not by noise or crowds, but by the faithful heart of a forgotten dog and the healing hands of a man who had lost everything. This story reminds us that even when we feel abandoned, unseen, or unworthy, grace can still find its way to us, through the kindness of strangers, the loyalty of a dog, or a second chance we didn't expect. Maybe you've been through your own storm. Maybe you're waiting for your miracle. Just know this, God still moves. He still sends help. And sometimes help has 4 legs and a gentle soul. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with Amen if you believe that no one is ever truly forgotten. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and pray that God continues to bless every viewer who finds this message.